Welcome to this launch of our book, Fathering an Australian History. Some of you will have been with us during the panel discussion upstairs about historical perspectives and contemporary Australian fathering and family life. Some of you will have joined us just now for this launch. I'm Al Thomson, and on behalf of our 5 co-authors, we're delighted to have you with us this evening. I want to acknowledge that we're on Wurundjeri country and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and a particular welcome to any Indigenous colleagues and friends who are with us this evening. Our book is full of oral histories, including First Nation oral histories. First Nations Australians have been sharing stories about country, culture and family for many tens of thousands of years, and that's a vital and vibrant continuing legacy. I'd like to thank the Royal Historical Society of Victoria and their staff, and especially Rosemary Cameron, Oliver Sperlich and Chelsea Pinkard, for inviting us to share their splendid building and providing so much organisational support for this event. I'd also like to thank my colleagues at Melbourne University Publishing who are here tonight, Catherine McGuinness, and I think the designer of the book, Phil, might be here because that's him as a small boy on the front cover. And the story of that photo is inside the cover. It's lovely to read. In the acknowledgements of the book, we thank so many people and organisations who helped us with the research and the writing. You know who you are, and I'm not going to list you all now. But I would like to make special thanks to my colleague and co-author Jill Barnard, who's done much of the organisational work for this event. And, thanks Jill. And I want to thank our international advisors, Carla Pascoe-Lee, who's here, and Lynn Abrams and Laura King, who are in Scotland and England, who helped us ground our Australian research with comparative international perspectives. A bit of housekeeping, if you haven't already worked out, there's a toilet just through there, there's another one up the stairs, and there's a fully accessible toilet just past the registration desk. And also, if you've got your phone on, perhaps you could switch it to mute, because we are being filmed. We've got 2 speakers this evening, and a little later I'll introduce Mike Roper, who will make some closing remarks on behalf of the authors. But now I'd like to introduce Jed Kearney, who will launch our book. Many of you will know of Jed as a nurse who led Australia's Nursing Union and then the ACTU, as federal member for Cooper in Melbourne's northern suburbs, and now in the Albanese Labor government working alongside Tanya Plibersek as Assistant Minister for Social Services and Assistant Minister for the Prevention of Family Violence. Jed's my local MP, and we love her. Thank you so much, Jed, for agreeing to do this, and welcome. Over to you.
Oh, I love you too, Al. I too acknowledge that we are on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. It is land that was never ceded and always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And it is wonderful that this oral history includes the voices of First Nations people. My schooling never did when we were taught history, never. And if we were lucky, Aboriginal people were referred to through the eyes of white historians and white men's observations. And having First Nations voices and experiences included in historical records like this is so incredibly important. It gives me hope that our children will learn properly through First Nations experiences and oral histories of their own, because as Al says, they've been telling their stories for thousands and thousands of years. They will understand a First Nations history and the impacts of colonisation, of intergenerational trauma, which can be hard to understand, but which I found illustrated so poignantly in the pages of this book, with Aboriginal people reflecting on their experiences of fathering and being fathered, amongst a lack of understanding of kinship and community parenting, the concepts of mothers and fathers and aunties and uncles, and where children fit in to that beautiful community was absolutely foreign to white authorities. Of hearing how they had to move constantly to escape those authorities, and of the vast and ongoing impacts of the stolen generations of dispossession and of racism. I acknowledge those storytellers and I thank them for sharing. I'd also like to acknowledge Alistair, Thomson, yes, a local constituent of mine, who I do love, and he has been incredibly helpful to me over my years as the local member of Cooper, and we have done some great work together, and I'm incredibly honoured to be asked to come along and launch the book. Thank you, Alistair, for asking me. The work that yourself, John Murphy, Kate Murphy, Johnny Bell and Jill Barnard have put into digesting 100 years of Australian fatherhood is truly impressive. I'd also like to acknowledge the incredible work of Dr. Sean Martin from 10 to Men and Catherine Anderson, a research director at the Australian Institute of Family Studies, and Associate Professor Catherine Kevin, who does incredible work researching the history of domestic violence. Now, I haven't launched many books in my life, but the ones that I have launched, I have a little pattern that I do. I like to read the book, which is a good start, and as I go through, I mark some interesting passages that I think would be nice to reflect on and perhaps even read to you during the course of the launch. Well, as I was reading this book, look what happened. I don't think I will be reading all of those to you because I'd be reading the whole book. So why did this happen when I read this book? I thought about it, and there are three main reasons. Apart from being a wonderful read, it is beautifully written, and apart from being an incredibly important book, I just love oral histories. I love them. I'm not a big fan of autobiographies, but I do love oral histories, and I know this isn't about me, but it kind of is, because I'm here. But someone else recording a story is profound. It's such a privilege to see into someone's life through a wonderful book like this. It's not quite the same as having an autobiography that's planned and written and edited and gone backwards and forwards and you come up with a polished product. This is straight from the heart. This is raw, it's beautiful, and they've captured it beautifully. The authors have managed a perfect balance of recording those important stories and then providing just enough commentary and analysis to help the reader understand what they just read. And neither overwhelms the book. It is beautiful. They help contextualise the comments, they make reference to who and how it was collected. They talk about the political and social stresses and the pressures and the context of the day, and it all comes together perfectly. They acknowledge the many wonderful sources that they've used to compile the histories, including, of course, the wonderful Australian Institute of Family Studies, who in my role right now I get to work directly with, and what an honour that is. And many of those sources have fascinating stories in themselves, which we learn about in the book, like, as we heard in the panel, the Royal Commission into Human Relationships undertaken in the 1970s. It was, as the authors opined, pretty much a royal commission into everything. And wonderfully, the authors ask many questions that make you think. They ask about the whys and the hows and the ifs and just maybes. Some of my favourite comments or questions that the authors ask throughout the book are, if only the interviewer had asked them this, we'd know that. And if only the interviewer hadn't stopped there and had kept going just a bit longer. Or if only we could come back later in time and see how our wonderful oral historians, the ones telling their stories, fared later in life. Because you're left wondering a lot of the time. Now, the second reason I have so many tags in this book, apart from my love of oral history, is that my life is reflected on every single page. And again, this isn't about me, but it kind of is. It hit a chord. Everything I read hit a chord with me, and I know that it will with everyone in this room. I'd find a passage that explains something about my father or other men in my life that I never really considered or understood. It helps me understand, and I'm sure it will everyone who reads it, who we are and why we are like we are. And maybe, just maybe, it will help change many of us and will help head us towards a society that we think we really need and want to head for. And maybe, just maybe, it will even ease some burdens. It makes us think about the sort of society we want to live in and forms part of the struggle on how we can get there. Fathers are an important part of the story, so impactful, and maybe we haven't invested enough in them. Books like this are seminal. I believe so. The third reason I tag so many points in this book is because I have a new portfolio in the government in the prevention of family and sexual violence. And again, this book isn't about me, but it kind of is. There's been so much wonderful work done in this space over the last half decade, and we had a great panel upstairs talking about fractured families before. But sadly, we are not moving the dial. Too many women are still being murdered by intimate partners. Sexual assaults are taking a staggering turn, with perpetrators being ever younger. With research showing that sexual predatory behaviour and assault is occurring in primary schools. There's growing influence of IT and online influencers. There's high incidence in migrant communities and our queer communities. There's a crisis of deaths for First Nations women. We need to make new inroads into turning the dial. Safety and gender equality will always be the main aim in combating this, but we have to include all men and all perpetrators. Not all men are perpetrators, we know that. But we have to include all men in this conversation. We have to include very young men and boys. In June, we received new insights from the Australian Institute of Family Studies, or AIFS, as we like to call them, via the 10 to Men study. Insights that are hard to hear and fathom. 1 in 3 Australian men aged 18 to 65 have used intimate partner violence in their lifetime. An estimated 120,000 men nationally each year are starting to use it for the first time. But we also learned that men who felt strongly that they had a quality relationship with a father or a father figure during childhood were 48% less likely to report ever having used intimate partner violence. Full stop, exclamation mark. That is why we in the government and everybody working in this space have to have a strong commitment to prevention and working with men and boys to end the cycle of violence. The behaviour of some men is the problem, but that doesn't mean they are not part of the solution. They are. All of us are. Civil rights activist and poet Maya Angelou said that each time a woman stands up for herself without knowing it, possibly without claiming it, she stands up for every woman. In the same vein, every father and father figure who takes an active, positive role in the home and their children's lives, and every man and boy who works to build healthy relationships, helps us get closer to our goal of a safer Australia for all. And we hear so many of those stories in this book. Supporting men also means expecting more, because the standard we walk past is the standard we accept. We need more men to step up, speak out, and stand alongside women and children in ending violence. And that means challenging harmful behaviours when they arise, modelling respect in our homes and in our workplaces, and raising boys to value empathy, equality, and accountability. The book makes several references to the intergenerational cycle of violence and the intergenerational cycle of fathering. Its authors write, the transmission of parental ideas and practices involves repetition or rejection, and often a mixture of both. Some follow cycles, some choose to break them. But overall, the impact of fathering is profound. I'm so pleased that AIFS is here supporting this launch. And maybe if we can get all of that research together, get the evidence, and we can get this book widely read and out there, and it's gorgeous and beautiful wisdom and insights, we might just start to make a difference for so many people. The introduction of the book finds that fathering has a deeply intimate significance while also affecting the wider society far beyond the family unit. So we need to support fathers and father figures who do take an active role in raising the next generation, and celebrate those silent achievers who do their best as positive role models and exemplars of what some call healthy masculinity. Now, there are so many threads running through the book that affect fathering and that come up time and time again, and no one responds the same to all of these issues. But it takes us through the decades from between the wars to the current day. The stories illustrate changing factors that affect fathering, and to a degree, some factors that are still with us today and haven't changed at all. It discusses gendered societal expectations that are all pervasive. It talks about the economic dynamics, including income, housing, class, and their impacts on fathers. Lone parenting, government legislation, the impacts of colonisation, genocide, the stolen generations and discrimination. It talks about migrant families and fathers, racial discrimination, parenting in the queer community, psychological and physical trauma, domestic violence, coercive control, the introduction of contraception, of childcare, of women's workforce participation, you name it. The book covers it. It's all there, and the impact on fathers. And it tells it beautifully through personal stories. But you know what there's also in this book? There's lots about love. In the interwar years, when fathering was distant, and breadwinning and providing was the essence of fatherhood, there is still a sense that providing is indeed an act of love, or it does hold effective significance, or near to love, it talks about, that it holds deep emotional significance. I personally found myself hanging on to that thought, because even though this book isn't about me, it kind of is. I am the second youngest of 8 children. I have no memory at all of my father before I was 5 years old. He was a publican, and by the time I came along in the line of children, 10 o'clock closing and Sunday trading meant Dad literally never, ever entered my waking hours. My older siblings have memories of him before that, but I don't. I remember one night one of my mum's girlfriends, Eiley, was over, and Eiley said to Mum, "Nance, you never come to card nights." And Mum said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Well, we have card nights every Thursday night and you never come. Mick comes, but you don't." Well, boy, was there a row. I remember Mum being so angry and bashing things around and cranking, and anyway, lo and behold, she packed us all up out of the house that she rented and moved all 9 kids and herself into the pub. We kicked all the residents out from the rooms upstairs and the family moved in. Mum was getting closer to Dad and making sure that he was around. And I remember sitting in the lounge downstairs in the bar looking at my father over there and saying to my little sister, because there's one below me, "That man over there's our Dad." I said, "Isn't he beautiful?" And he was beautiful. He was an extremely handsome man. And I remember the first time he ever spoke to me. We got such a shock. We were in trouble. My little sister and I were bickering, and Mum was really growling at us. You know, Mum was the disciplinarian, she was the carer, she was everything, as you could imagine. Anyway, Dad happened to come upstairs, I don't know why, and he said, "Oh, Nance, what's wrong? Why are you growling at the girls?" Well, she kind of laid into him a bit and said, "You deal with it," and walked away. Dad looked at the two of us. I held my little sister's hand because I didn't know what was going to happen. He sat down and he rubbed his hands through his hair and he said, "Girls, don't upset your mother." We just looked at him. He said, "If your mum gets upset with you, she gets upset with me, and that's not good." And we're looking at him still, and he's not getting through, I could remember. And he said, "You know what?" He was obviously planning to sort of buy a holiday house, but he said, "If you don't upset your mum, we could have a holiday house by the beach. Would you like that?" And my little sister said, she's braver than me, "Can it have bunk beds?" Dad said, "Yeah." We got a holiday house with bunk beds in Torquay. I remember another vivid memory of my father, and I'm sorry, I am indulging myself now, it kind of is all about me. But we were 9 children, we moved into the hotel, my mother ran the kitchen, and we all worked in the pub. I was just a little girl, I did dishes, I cut bread, I helped in the kitchen, my brothers ran the bar, my sisters ran trays for the meal services. And my brother wanted to get paid. And my father said, "No, son, doesn't work like that. You don't get paid, you get a roof over your head, you get fed, that's the family business." He tried to join the Liquor and Allied Trades Union and they wouldn't have him. And so he called a family meeting and we were upstairs in what we called the function room, which is where we had weddings and parties and things. And we're all sitting around the table and he said, "Right, I'm a little girl, I can't remember, maybe I was 7. I remember sitting there looking at him and he said, "We're going to form the Kearney Family Union. You're going to elect me secretary, okay?" We go, "Okay." He must have been about 16, I think. Anyway, we drew up a little log of claims. I'd be lying if I said I remembered exactly what was in the little log of claims, but I do remember my sister saying, if you've got an exam in the morning, you shouldn't have to work the dinner service the night before. Anyway, my mum and dad came in and sat down and they said, what's going on? And Russ said, you're talking to the secretary of the Kearney Family Union, Dad, and we've got a log of claims. Pushed it over. My mother thought this was nonsense, absolute nonsense. Children are to be seen and not heard, and she stormed off. Oh, my dad loved it. He loved it. He said, right, son, show me the log of claims. We went through it. Anyway, the next week, we got paid. I remember, who remembers little yellow envelopes? Name on it? I had $4 in there. I thought it was Christmas. So they are probably two of my most vivid memories of my dad in the pub days. I never really felt much love from Dad, but I always knew that he cared about us and that really he was just the typical dad that thought it was his job to provide for us. Unfortunately, the pub that we lived in was compulsorily acquired and knocked down for a road that went through it, and we say that really nearly killed him actually, but it meant that he found himself at home with us, and I was well into my teen years and there were grandchildren around all the time, and one day he was nursing my nephew, who was all of 2 or 3, and reading the newspaper to him, as you do, and he said to my mum, he looked up and he said, Nance, I never knew they were little humans. They're quite interesting, aren't they? I missed out on a lot. And Mum said, yeah, Mick, you missed out on a lot. And I hear those stories in this book. You will read about lots of dads that did that. My partner Lee, who was going to be here tonight but he wasn't here, his dad was a fly-in, fly-out worker. He drove a dozer clearing forests in Tasmania, I know. But that was his job, and he was away for weeks and a month at a time. And there's a famous story about when his dad came home one time, Lee was about 4. He didn't like his dad coming home because he interrupted the family dynamics and took his mother's attention away from him. So while his father was in the garden picking weeds, Lee picked up a massive rock and threw it at his head and tried to kill him. Get him out of the way. Lee remembers doing that. But he said he then realised that his father wasn't going anywhere and he was around to stay and, oh well, he better get used to it. And he had a traditional, affectionate parent. But he was adopted. Lee was adopted, and that brought a whole range of complexities to being fathered and his experience as a father. And things like that are talked about in the book too. And, Lee reflects on things. We all reflect on life, and he wished he could have spent longer with his children. And now he's retired, he hopes to focus on his grandchildren. And all of those regrets are discussed in here. And I'll finish up by saying, I look at my sons and my sons-in-law, and they're very heavily influenced by Bluey, which is in here now as well, discusses the phenomenon that is Bluey. They're much more engaged young men with the children. They share responsibilities. They show affection so much more readily. They're present at births. They have access to parental leave. There's less stigma about affection and love. And it is beautiful to watch them parenting my grandchildren. And I look at my grandsons and I wonder, I really hope I live to see what sort of fathers they will be. But there's still a long way to go. We know that women still are predominantly the carers and take up the most of the caring, even though they are working now. They've just added work onto their many roles. A lot of men are still considered the main breadwinners. Our society is still really structured around men as such. We still see childcare. We talk about, even us as policymakers talk about childcare as women, helping women into work, not helping men. The authors actually quote Annabel Crabb, who wrote, "It is women who change and adapt to the new reality of child, not men." And so many of the mores about fathering remain. First Nations men are still straddling two worlds, struggling with keeping culture and connection alive while dealing with negative stereotypes of Indigenous fathers. And closing the gap seems to be more and more difficult and getting further away. And they're constantly having to reconcile a traditional Aboriginal family whereby a biological mother and father, and I'm quoting here, comprise only part of the team that rears a child. And they have to reconcile that with white society's expectations of single breadwinners and caring mothers. Newly immigrant families are arriving with trauma of war. We have refugees and asylum seeker families really struggling to raise their kids with mental health issues. There's still so much to be done. But works like this, for a policymaker like me, it's profound. There's so many lessons to be learned. It's such a meaningful history. And it not only tells us about the past, but it tells us what we can do and how we can help fathers and really reinforce the vital and important role that fathering has in society. I want to thank all the authors for pulling this together. I want to thank all of the people who, I know many of them aren't here, but if I could, I would hug every single one who gave their story to this book. And I encourage you all to buy it and to read it and to pass it on and get as many people as possible to read this wonderful book. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Jed. That was beautiful. I'm so glad we have so many women like Jed running our country. It's terrific. Thank you. To conclude the formal part of this event, we've invited Michael Roper to make some closing remarks. There are just too many authors of this book for each of us to speak, but I do want to make a shout out to my co-authors, John Murphy, Kate Murphy, Johnny Bell and Jill Barnard. It's been a pleasure and a privilege researching and writing this book together. We decided Mike was the perfect person to represent us in the book because he's worked with us all the way, not an author, but in the book team. Mike and I were history students together in Melbourne in the 1980s, and we both then lived and worked as historians in England, where Mike became Professor of Sociology at Essex University. Mike has written several wonderful books about war, work and family life, all of which use intimate life stories to explore historical experience and meaning. Over the past 6 years, Mike has been a member of our Australian Research Council-funded project team on the history of fathering, working alongside the authors, reading every word of every draft and offering wise counsel. Thanks so much, Mike, for your contribution to this book and for joining us now and agreeing to speak. Over to you, Mike.
I want to start with a comment by Patrick. Born around 1923, I'm one of 3 generations of fathers whose stories open the book. When asked in 1998 what he thinks a father's role is, he says, "It's just being around and to be taken for granted." And when I read that passage, it stopped me in my tracks. What does that mean? This is how he describes his own fathering. Quote, "I put the food on the table and paid the rent. I was the breadwinner, so I had to keep going at it." He talks about the birth of his son. Quote, "When it happened, it was just something normal that happened, and that was it." His statements are oblique and they're difficult for the historian to work with. Fatherhood seems a kind of a non-identity, something you just did, certainly defined by financial provision, but beyond that, Patrick seems unsure, either in the way he defines his own experience as a father or his notion of the ideal father. He seems to find the interviewer's questions difficult, perhaps puzzling. Patrick's comments encapsulate the problem that faces the historian of fatherhood. For much of the 20th century, it wasn't clear what fathering meant beyond breadwinning, and yet when the interviewees in this book look back at their childhoods, they all feel profoundly influenced, for better or worse, by how they were fathered, or because they were not fathered. Despite the feeling that fathering just happened, fathers clearly were and are at the centre of intimate domestic relationships. So I think, Al, I look back on my email trail in my fatherhood folder and I found that the first communication with you about this project was, I think, October 2015, which is 10 years ago. And I think that was at the point where grant applications were being thought about. It's been a very long process. As Al says, I didn't contribute directly to the research or writing, but I participated in all the meetings where the materials and organising themes were identified, and I read and commented on all the drafts. We were early adopters of Zoom because the meetings had to be held across a 12,000-mile gap, and that also meant that if you know the time difference between the UK and Australia, they were always at either end of the day, which meant that occasionally I saw glimpses of the authors parenting. So children would appear, and you know who you are. Occasionally grandchildren would appear. So I could see parenting going on in live. I always looked forward to our meetings. They were collegiate and informal, but exceptionally well facilitated. And I can testify to just how much work this book has taken. Work locating the sources, work sifting through them, interpreting them, and constructing historical context around them. My colleagues at Essex have a term which I always bridled at, but I'm going to use it now. They used to judge a book by saying, well, is it a big book? Well, I think we know already the answer to that question from it. This is definitely a big book. It's ambitious in its chronological scale, although the start date is formally 1920, because it relies on oral sources. Some of those people are remembering back to the 19th century and have inherited family memory. So actually it's a longer chronology than 100 years. It takes you through the aftermath of the First World War, the Great Depression, the Second World War, the impact of Reconstruction after the Second World War, the impact of second wave feminism, gay rights and Indigenous rights movements from the 1970s, the impact of economic reconstruction in the last quarter of the 20th century, and finishing with a discussion that I think highlights the diversity of fathering in the 21st century. I mean, it's sociology and history. How wonderful is that? The chronological sweep allows some fascinating findings to emerge. We discover that despite the breadwinner model being fundamental to perceptions of fathering and embedded within social policy for much of the 20th century, in fact, such an arrangement had really only a very short life in the period after the Second World War, perhaps for 2 or 3 decades. Since the 1970s, public perceptions of what a father should be have grown, but we find that today's fathers often have less time than their breadwinner fathers. We learn that the new father is actually quite old, in that successive generations of fathers have often claimed to be more involved in family life than their fathers. But as the authors show through their meticulous research, these claims are often hard to substantiate. This book is ambitious in its use of evidence. It's certainly the most ambitious oral history study I think I've ever read. It draws on 4 major national studies comprising over 1,300 interviews, which were conducted from the early 1980s to the 2010s. Just sifting through these accounts to find the ones about fathers and fathering is a major exercise, let alone analysing them. And such a study could only come from Australia. You don't know how lucky you are, where oral history has flourished, in part because of the work of the authors in this book. They make a strong case for why oral history is a good source for the study of fathering. It offers multiple perspectives. The grandfather or grandmother not only looks back on how they were parented, but on how they parented themselves and how their children parent. It's very complex. It allows you to see intergenerational influences. It also allows reflection across lots of sets of different relationships. The interviewer remembers as a child, a parent, a grandparent. To my mind, the deepest and the most considered reflections come from people as they remember their childhoods. We are apt to seek in the histories of our parents an answer to the question of how we came to be who we are. And oral history taps into that quest. And I've been fascinated by the discussion earlier today about fractured families, and it made me think some of the deepest thinking about families comes from people who've had experiences of fractured families. Those sorts of families really make you think deeply about how you came to be who you are. What's particularly impressive in this book is the way it sets the testimonies of family members alongside each other. The mother and the daughter, the father and the son, and so on, to reveal different perspectives. Joy Percy, for example, the daughter of a disabled First World War veteran, gives a detailed account of her father's domestic violence towards her mother, but the mother barely mentions it. Such differences are teased out with great care and perception in this book, sometimes through what the social scientist calls triangulation. And again, Australia is very fortunate in having digitised records that allow this kind of cross-checking between perhaps service records, other kinds of records, and the oral testimony. They can really be grounded in alternative sort of approaches and interpretations. And these often reveal substantial gaps between what fathers, for example, say about themselves and what they actually do. Fathering is a methodologically ambitious book. Above all, it stands out because of the sensitive ways it teases out the meanings of accounts and its carefully weighed interpretations. It's alert to the ever-present difference in oral history between the time of telling and the time told, or to put it in another way, between the now of the interview and the past that's being described. It's honest about the opacity of its sources, the difficulty of making final interpretations. It's honest about the limitations of previous studies, which include the author's own, whose interviews on family life sometimes conspired in the asymmetrical focus on mothers. One of the things that I think was a real benefit of our meetings was that when we read interpretations, when we read testimony, we could all comment on it, and you could see different people thinking different things. And I think part of the book's maturity in the way it does all this comes from that discussions we had about what's the right way to see this testimony, how should it be understood. Finally, the book's ambitious in the way it situates these oral histories in the broader political, social and economic context. I mean, you could pick up this book without a particular interest in fatherhood and you'd find out an awful lot about the social, economic and cultural history of Australia in the past 100 years. The book has an elegant way of situating these relationships. It makes a distinction between the social forces that influence fathering, like those of the prevalent ideas of what fathers should be, which is fatherhood, and what fathers actually do, which is the fathering. And as I recall, the notion to describe the history as one of fathering occurred quite late in the day, but it's exactly the right title for this book. It conveys to the reader that the focus here is on the experiences of fathering and of being fathered, seen through the broader frame of social norms, economic transformations and politics. It's that approach that allows for the diversity where you find stories that buck the trend, fathers that managed to be intimate and nurture in the most difficult circumstances, for example. So, without doubt, this is a big book. Paradoxically, however, to finish, it's quite a light book. I refer here to tone. Reading the final version, I was really struck by how well the narrative flows, despite its often weighty and difficult, and sometimes distressing matter. But because of the theoretical clarity, because of the considered interpretations, and above all, because of the vivid stories at its centre, it's a bloody good read. The prose is never stolid. The book invites you to pick it up and keep reading, and I hope you will.